All right, welcome. It looks like people are filing on in. I just want to introduce myself really quick. My name is Austin Grajek. I'm with YouAttest and I work in our business development side of things. So I take a lot of feedback from whatever we hear in these webinars and from Kelly, our expert, and I try to implement them back into what YouAttest does, which is cloud-based, just identity auditing. First, I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time out of your business day or whatever is going on to hop on and listen to just some of the expertise from our good friend Kelly. We're really excited about it, and I'm more excited just to see the number of professionals that are hopping on this call. We're gonna give a few more minutes, just probably about one or two, to let people file in. But once that's all taken care of, we'll launch this thing and we'll get right into it. So thank you so much for being here. Cannot say how much I appreciate it enough. All right, excellent. Well, it seems like a good handful of people are joining, so I don't want to keep you all waiting. Let me first start off by just introducing Kelly Gilmore. We're lucky to know Kelly as a friend, and Kelly he's well versed in everything. He is a certified Chief Information Security Officer, certified information privacy professional for Europe, certified in investment performance measurement, certified in information system security professional. So he has over 25 years of industry experience. As mentioned, we're really lucky to have him, and we're thrilled to have you all on this. At this point, I'm just going to go run through and talk about what we'll be discussing today. We're going to start off by having Kelly provide a breakdown, outline access control strategy, the importance of auditing specifically in the area of application access. When he goes into this, he's going to be lightly touching on ISO, Nist, and the COBIT frameworks. Following that, I will just do a quick demo showing the cloud-based auditing tool that will help address these areas. And then finally, we will open this up to some questions. So we'll give you the opportunity to ask Kelly any questions you have, ask myself any questions. So keep that in mind and jot those down as Kelly's going through some of his key tips and some of the areas that we're talking about. But with that being said, I'm going to pass it off to Kelly and give him the opportunity to introduce himself. So this is Kelly Gilmore.
Thank you, Austin. Just real quick, are you able to hear me?
Perfectly
okay?
Loud and clear. Thank you so much for being here, Kelly.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity. And I just wanted to say good morning or afternoon to everyone attending. Well, I've worked in, as Austin mentioned, I've worked in the field of information technology for a little more than 25 years. I worked for several large and small organizations. So this particular topic is very much near and dear to me. Specifically because during the past 12 years, I've focused my career on security, privacy, as well as compliance. In that time, I've also been working for organizations building secure public and private cloud infrastructure, security products, and services. So it's an important topic, and I just wanted to get the information out there, and I'm very excited, to be part of this webinar series. So if you move to the next slide. Excellent. I think you're already ahead of me. Great. Again, I am excited to participate in the YouAttest webinar series, Ask the CISO. The topic again is 3 key responsibilities for auditing application access control. And next slide there. So controls. Let's just make sure we're level setting a few things as we start to dive in. Things are going to move pretty quickly, but to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page, I just wanted to kind of give a little background. And so with respect to controls, there are 3 types of controls, and they are classified by their purpose. Those 3, of course, are administrative, technical, and physical. Administrative controls, sometimes called procedural controls, codify how people should conduct themselves and their activities within the organization. These typically include official policies, standards, procedures, guidelines, things along those lines. Technical controls, sometimes called logical controls, are technology solutions that manage risk, especially in a digital world. Technical controls can include firewalls, intrusion detection, IDS, data loss prevention, network access control, all the way down to ACLs, technical, logical settings, which like access controls themselves can be considered technical controls. Last but not least, of course, is physical controls. It goes by no other name, and it manages risk in the physical world. These specific controls, these types of controls can also be broken down by different attributes, defining what they do. And those attributes can be preventative, detective, or corrective. But that's really not in the scope of what we want to talk about today. So we'll be focusing on control types when discussing application access controls today, focusing mostly on administrative and technical controls. Next slide, Austin. Great. So kind of stepping up a little bit, there are three keys to effective access control, whether it's for administrative, technical, or procedural, or physical. There's basically there's three keys to an effective control. And it's kind of a circular thought. If you select an appropriate control to meet the objective, most effective access control strategies, of course, use layered control approaches. So you have an administrative type control as well as a technical control. In some cases, maybe even a physical control. But you assign, you select, and you apply the control. The next step, of course, is to test the control. And you want to test the control before it's applied in production as well as after it's applied in production. You want to make sure that it's applied appropriately. The next step, of course, is to review the effectiveness of that control and make adjustments as needed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean one time. You really should be reviewing your controls' effectiveness constantly. Again, it's a circular thing. As you determine a control, it may not be working as well, you need to make an adjustment. That adjustment may require that you go back to step one, select another control to meet whatever the objective might be. It may be a new objective. It may be a slightly changed objective due to some change in the organization or personnel. There's many reasons to do that. Okay, next slide, please. Whether you're talking about data or applications, it is incredibly important. Paramount actually might be a better term for an organization to ensure proper access controls and related processes are in place. The statement here, access control is one of the most important concerns addressed by the CISO or security leader. I mean, it is. It truly is. It really can't be stated in any other way. Poorly managed controls, weaknesses, deficiencies can all facilitate violations of policy as well as security incidents. And we all know security incidents can be small or they can be absolutely huge. Access controls are the basis for protecting assets and, more importantly, the organization that owns them. So those are the kind of how I approach everything here. It's the access control protects the organization, and that's the intent. So there are really four core elements to access control. Many in the industry only identify the first three in the list here, but in my opinion, they are mistaken. The core elements are, of course, identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability, or in the industry, it's known as IAAA. Of course, we're talking about access control here, and identification is defined as access control. Well, in order for an access control to be effective, it must provide a way to identify the individual, period. That's, if you don't know who you're dealing with, that's, you've already lost the game. The weakest identification capabilities run the risk of identifying a wrong person and giving them access to the system. So the next one, of course, is authentication. Identification requires authentication. And authentication is the process of ensuring that the identity which is in use is authentic, or that it's being used by the right person. The most common form of authentication involves validating a password tied to a username. Additionally, you can fingerprints, retinal scans, smart cards, encryption keys. Those are all other methods for authentication. And then authorization. Authorization is a set of actions allowed to a particular identity, makes up the meat of authorization. So read, write, execute permissions are all tied to a username. That's authorization. Accountability, which is commonly not included, as I mentioned before, but it's often referred to as audit, tracing an action to a subject's identity or prove who or what a given action was performed. Those are all key elements to what we're, the topic, access control. Next slide, please. So organizations define the access control strategy typically in an access control policy. And I'm going to cover this fairly quickly, as we can go quite in depth here. So I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. But the policy should include, there are other things which it can include, but should include these 5 items. Number 1, types of access controls. Types of access controls include discretionary access controls, mandatory access controls, role-based access controls, even rule-based or attribute-based access controls. Those will all be defined within the section under types of access controls allowed. 2, methods of authentication and authentication processes. That really is requirements around single-factor or multi-factor authentication. Number 3, identify management processes, identity management processes, excuse me. That's clearly directory, identity access management solutions, things along those lines. 4, authorization standards. The authorization standards typically will be, what's used in particular situations. Those include least privilege principle, need to know, separation of duties, and how they're applied to access. And then, of course, last but not least is access administration. This section typically includes information around account provisioning, monitoring, and review, as well as termination. The goal really is to authenticate and authorize individuals to access the data, applications, or resources they are allowed to access and use. That is the goal, of course, of access controls. Next slide, please. So what is access control management? Access control management is a process that is integrated into every organization's IT environment. We're all pretty familiar with it, I'm sure. This can include traditional directories and or identity and access management solutions. These systems provide access control software, which includes a user database and management tools to provide access control policies, auditing, and the enforcement of those policies. Next slide, please. Sorry, Aston, I keep forgetting to mention.
Oh, you're completely fine. You're doing great.
So how are access controls managed in the organizations today? All right, I'm sure you're aware of the access control solutions you're all using in your organizations, and there are many out there with differing capabilities. Some include Active Directory, Okta's Universal Directory, Azure Active Directory, and there are other federation technologies out there. We could spend hours discussing what what those are, but that's not really what I want to highlight here. It's more like background. So let's leave that there and discuss access controls at a slightly higher level. So on that higher level, it's important to know there's a relationship between organizational maturity and how access controls are managed. Let's move on to the next slide, please. When you're talking about maturity, and I'm sure most attending here are familiar with maturity, the different maturity models. One of the best known is the CMMI Institute's capability maturity model integration. Clearly, I know this particular model's application primarily in the area of security governance and risk assessments. It's widely used for benchmarking business performance capabilities, and it can be applied to almost any activity within the business. But looking at this particular graphic here, I think the main takeaways that I would like for you to have is the breakdown between the maturity levels 0 and 1, 2 and 3, and 4 and 5, or respectively low, medium, and high maturity levels. And the reason I'm breaking that out is because it ties directly into what's coming up in the next slide. But what I want to get across here is and kind of define what low maturity level might indicate in an organization is incomplete, ad hoc, or reactive organizational processes. That's typically what when you're dealing with a low maturity level as far as those processes. Now, keep in mind, this does not necessarily relate to the size of the organization. Small organizations can have a high maturity level. It happens a lot. Then there's also large organizations that can have a very low maturity level when it comes to organizational processes. So I want to just get that out off the table right now. Picking back up, medium maturity level indicates that processes are managed and defined reasonably well. High, of course, indicates that processes are managed quantitatively and optimized and continually optimizing, so continual improvement, that type of thing. So, everyone wants to be in the high category. Reality shows, and the percentages on the bottom there indicate that the majority are not. The majority are in the level 2 and level 3 area. Oh, and another tip. Anybody taking just about any type of security-related certification training, this will be a topic you will want to be familiar with if you're not already. Okay, next slide. Okay, so turning the relationship kind of around, and in the context of access control management, it can be stated that as an organization improves its governance processes, which of course include policies and procedures and controls, the organization is considered more mature. That's pretty obvious and straightforward. So I'm not going to dive in much deeper other than, of course, these 2 points. An organizational maturity increases, again, processes and capabilities. Let me restate that. As organizational maturity increases, processes and capabilities, the more effective the organization's access controls tend to be. There's a relationship there. As the snapshot of where the industry, as a snapshot of where the industry is regarding maturity, as stated earlier, 87%, a vast majority of organizations appraised have a maturity level in the 2 or 3 range, which is considered a moderate maturity level, and only 12% have a maturity level of 4 to 5. The idea, of course, is that every organization continues to improve, and that starts with every process, every procedure, guidelines, standards, policy. We continue to build, and don't feel bad if you're not in the 4 or 5 range. A majority of us live in that median range, 87% of the organizations out there. Next slide. All right. Getting back to the topic, how access controls are managed in the organizations today. Okay, so we can break it down into 3 areas, effectively low, medium, and high, kind of follow along with that maturity level. In organizations with a low maturity level, user access is generally managed in an ad hoc manner, sometimes locally within the application or within the data store containers, possibly using traditional access control types like mandatory access control, discretionary access control, and in some cases, hopefully, role-based access control. You know, people who use Google, one good example of discretionary access controls are you know, you can share items within Google. That's a very good example of discretionary access control, because the controls themselves are controlled by the user, who the owner, if you will. Whereas, you know, mandatory, of course, are a little higher on the scale there. They typically are used and controlled by administrators, IT, that type of thing. So anyway, back to this. So in orgs with a moderate maturity level, user access is more likely managed using an identity and access management solution, IAM, using some defined processes and access controls. Typically, those access controls will be role-based access control. In those organizations, applications, as well as data stores and, you know, and other assets, will have specific groups created. Hopefully those groups are then tied to a specific role within the organization or the department. And of course, it eases in the ability to manage those types of group memberships and access to whatever that particular asset is. Last but not least, of course, in orgs with a high maturity level, user access is likely managed using an identity and access management solution. This is tied to an enterprise HR system. ERP sometimes falls into this category. And that system is managing access control via integrated tools, which apply access rights or entitlements based on the predefined authorization policies. Again, taking advantage of role-based access as well as attribute-based access. Next slide, please. So process maturity, as discussed so far, and the 3 core access control concepts, which are identity, authentication, and authorization, can all be applied to the topics defined earlier in the access control policy. Of course, you've seen this slide before. But there's one topic in the access administration section, specifically monitoring and review, which is vitally important and brings us to the real topic or subject I'm hoping to talk about, which is accountability and specifically user access review. So, next slide, sorry. So, user access review. This can also be known as account attestation, access recertification, user entitlement review, periodic access review, or PARS. It's the process of review by the data application owner or custodian, ensuring employees and or users only have access to essential systems and unauthorized employees or users do not. It's very straightforward, not a difficult concept, of course, but it's an important topic. So let's talk about the next slide. Why is it so important? Why are user access reviews important? Well, Security 101 kind of is the #1 thing. Conducting user entitlement reviews is critical to manage, monitor, and audit the user access lifecycle from account creation to termination. That is the statement right there. So to kind of put that into a context that everyone can grasp, if you consider the number of employees that have left your organization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, during a defined period of time, let's just say the last quarter, if you take that number, those individuals, now think about the number of current employees who have changed roles or taken on new responsibilities, perhaps moving from the IT department or development into a sales engineering role, something along those lines. Now consider their systems, their applications, and the data those current and former employees have or had access to. The systems, applications, and data stores that each user individual had access to can, of course, be different, which again increases the complexity, difficulty, and importance of thorough user access review. The number of possible permutations of access settings, even in a small environment, can actually be quite huge. So, doing the math, it really highlights the importance of the user access review. Next slide, please. Again, why is it important? Well, user access reviews also reduce corporate risk. And the CISO, the C-levels, one of the main responsibilities of a CISO or security leader within an organization is to reduce corporate risk. That's financial risk, that's all types of risk, and specifically any costs associated to those risks. And believe me, they can be huge. So we can be talking about compliance findings, possible penalties from those findings, kind of in the PCI kind of scope being fined, data breaches, data or privacy breaches. In the US, we've got CCPA in California. We've got, I think, 13 other privacy regulations that are coming into play soon within the different states. We've got GDPR over in the EU. We've got PIPEDA in Canada. We have a lot of regulatory requirements that we have to meet, and fines associated just in GDPR alone or HIPAA can be huge. 2 to 4% of gross sales can be a very huge fine and very difficult for an organization to to deal with. But on a lower scale, even the reduction in software licensing costs and maintenance is important too. So cost can also be not necessarily related to fines, but also in, hey, I can save money by monitoring my licensing costs. Next slide, please. So one other big piece to this puzzle of why it's important is compliance with common security controls, frameworks, standards, and certifications. So if you're ISO certified, you're of course going to want to maintain that certification. There are a lot of different sections within ISO that pertain to access controls, including 9.11, which is specifically around access control policy, 9.21, user registration and deregistration. So, these specifically ISO, it outlines the the individual controls, which are of course related to providing that security. And of course, if you're ISO, you have to go through audit. And if someone were to lose their compliance certification, they would be very upset about that. So again, we have a lot of policy control policies, and the associated sections within ISO that relate to the requirements of that particular certification. So next slide. Nist is another compliance standard, which, I mean, there's no certification for Nist. However, if you're a federal agency, of course, you have to meet Nist due to FISMA. So there's different sections within Nist: account management, access enforcement, separation of duties, least privilege. Those are just but a few. So completing your audits, setting up your access controls, those are all part of complying with a particular standard. Again, I'm sorry, next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. COBIT, another, being COBIT compliant. There are specific sections within COBIT, DSS 06, manage user identity, logical access. I'm not going to read these all, but as you can see, there are specific sections within each of these controls, these frameworks, which pertain to user access controls and that therefore apply to application control. And next slide. The last reason is, quite frankly, it's the law. The regulations below on this list here all have mandatory user access review requirements, and that includes Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI, HIPAA, and GDPR. There are others. I didn't go through the list there, but just know that it's important to do for a lot of internal reasons, and it's also important to do for regulatory and, of course, statutory reasons. All right, next slide. Okay, so how are user access reviews done in organizations? Again, it kind of comes back to the topic of maturity level. So organizations with high maturity levels typically use identity lifecycle management and GRC tools such as SailPoint, Savient, Oracle, EmpowerID, IBM. There's dozens of them out there. The one thing that they all have in common is generally they're all pretty expensive. Large organizations as well as small, again, if they have a high maturity level, these are the types of tools that they might be implementing. For the rest of us, we typically will use manual or semi-manual methods for reviewing, including different identity and access management solutions, hopefully some which include features built in to assist with review processes. Niche ILM and GRC solutions. There's several of them out there that are actually very reasonable in price, but unfortunately, the majority of us use the dreaded spreadsheet. And it's a very painful process. The spreadsheet itself of trying to do a user access review for all of the assets for an organization can be quite devastating, actually. So let's move on here. Next slide, please. All right. So the process for conducting an effective review, it actually seems fairly straightforward. There really are 3 basic steps. But when you really get into it, there's a lot of things which need to be done, need to be addressed, or need to be considered at the very least. Full disclosure, I actually found this article listed here, Best Practices to Conduct a User Access Review. It's written by Sharon Shea, and it's actually published on techtarget.com. I found it to be very helpful, in my review, and I kind of fell back to it to help with preparation for this webinar. But it really helps kind of solidify in your mind the different processes, steps that need to be done. So I highly recommend reviewing this article at some point. There's other articles out there too, one I can think of right off the top of my head is an article by Vincent Shira. It's called Rethinking User Access Certifications. It's on mySACA.org, but another great article. But back to our topic here. The best practices to conduct a user access review are the 3 steps: define a user access review policy, conduct the review, and then do the remediation reporting. Very straightforward, not a difficult concept. Now, the complexities are kind of when you take it to the next level. So next slide, please. All right. So defining a user access policy, user access review policy, should include at least these 6 steps, starting with an inventory of the enterprise assets. This is a list of assets users can be granted access to. And it should include your entire enterprise, all assets, data assets, everything. Again, we want to focus primarily on application access here, but in the reality of the user access review, there's many different types. So we want to collect all the information and then focus on a specific area that we want to address at that particular time. And that will be clear in a second here. But this should include databases, applications, networks, systems, operating systems, even data centers and rooms, buildings, etc. These are all the types of assets, enterprise assets that should be in inventory. The next step, of course, is to list the owners of each asset, identify the owner. Right? It's very straightforward. Could be a manager, could be an administrator, could be a team. But the owner may even designate a custodian. It's hard to say, but the owner should then provide a detailed list of the types of data, the accessible content, data classifications, labeling requirements for those assets, and that information is then mapped to the next requirement, really, which is the access levels and roles. So we need to be able to assign responsibilities down at a granular level. Think role-based access controls. Very important. Providing the least privilege necessary for a job function is critical to eliminating user security gaps. Of course, we want to look at access levels, roles, all of which typically are included in a corporate security policy anyway. So you can refer back to a corporate security policy. The next section, of course, is reporting types and frequency, and this is one of the most important parts. There are several different types of access control audits. User access audits specifically. There's trigger-based, which is one-offs initiated by some event, like employee changes departments or that employee gets terminated. Others are typically scheduled on a regular basis, such as like the topic today, user access reviews. They can be conducted per system or per employee, or a combination. And just to be clear, a per system review is an audit of controls based on who has access to each system, whereas a per employee review examines access controls privileges based on which system a particular employee accesses. So the next primary topic is determine review frequency. And this in particular will vary by organization, but depending on the system, reviews can be run monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, etc. And then of course the focus in determining the frequency, of course, is you want to audit your high-risk assets more often, while low-risk systems can be assessed, less frequent. So, second to the last is deprovisioning processes. Onboarding and offboarding is primarily what this is talking about. The enterprise user access should detail corporate provisioning and deprovisioning processes. I don't think I need to get into too much detail on what provisioning and deprovisioning is, but it's incredibly important, specifically by removing access rights to the assets. That is the most important thing, removing those rights when someone is terminated or offboarded or moved to a different position. Regular access reviews will also help with notification. So managers, as they review data, you know, and this also applies to onboarding and offboarding. When those occur, managers review these processes, it can highlight areas that maybe need to change and need to be updated. And so making sure that the deprovisioning process is communicated and reviewed by the different managers within the different organizations can greatly help in making sure that we don't have any security gaps. And last but not least, of course, training and when to enlist others' help. That's pretty obvious. We want to train our managers on how to do a review. It's very important that they understand what's important, and specifically not to give access for the sake of giving access. Allowing a manager to give someone access just because it's easier is really not a good thing. Additionally, the C-suite needs to be involved here as well. The CISO or your security leader within the organization, of course, this is highly important on their list, but it's also very important to share this with the other C-levels, not only for business buy-in, but to make sure that the proper importance is given to this type of process. So involving the management team in this, in different fashions, educating them on the process is very important. And then let's go to the next slide, please. So the next step, of course, conduct the review, right? So how do you do that? Well, we create a list of all the databases, apps, systems, etc., and who has access to them. We include all employees, third parties, such as vendors, service providers, etc. We send a report specifically for each asset. So for every asset, you have an owner. You send a report for that asset to the owner. You can of course, accumulate several if that owner has several. You send that report to the owner, who then audits the list to verify who has access and what level of access, and whose access privileges should be changed or revoked. Next, the asset owner should notify department managers in the event of changes for their members. It's very important that if someone's reviewing their content, they are the owner of data, and they need to make a change, like they're removing access to an entire department. It's very important for that individual, that manager, that owner, to notify the other manager to make sure that's what really needs to happen. And it's not on security, it's not on IT to do that, it's actually on that data owner. Last but not least, you need to set a deadline for the review and stay on top of that asset owner to make sure that they sign off on that report. But it's paramount. You have to get it done, and sometimes you do have to. You have to be a little bit pesky when it comes to getting those asset owners to do the review. And overall, traditional user review, and I'm talking specifically about spreadsheet, where all access is reviewed maybe on a quarterly or annual basis. This can often overwhelm the reviewer, and which unfortunately leads to less thorough review, which again in turn leads to higher risk. And we really want to avoid doing something which of course is going to increase risk. So what we can do to kind of offset that, of course, is automation, using programmatic methods to assist. And then of course also delegation, allowing a owner to delegate to a custodian, or to another individual can be very helpful, in those respects. Next slide, please. So the last piece of this puzzle, of course, is to remediate and report. So remediation, of course, once we have all of the attestations from the users, from the owners, excuse me, we want to execute those changes based on those reviews. We want to remove any revoked access, update employee privileges as needed. Generating a new access report after completing that stage helps to make sure that the changes have gone into effect. Pretty straightforward. Reporting is, of course, probably the most important part of this. I mean, we're doing all this work. The last thing we want to do is not adequately report. So we want to finalize, print, store the report, and keep it as an audit trail. Specifically because this is evidence of access recertification, which is needed for compliance. So you make absolutely certain that you pull this together, finalize, print, and store that report. It's important too that this report should include role changes, previous or current roles, access rights, who approved them, etc. The names of the system's owners, and of course any roles or notes for further actions, or upon review items which may help facilitate faster review in the future. I think that the really important thing is documentation. This is the documentation part, and as in any control selection, any process within an organization, documentation of decisions is really, really important. So don't forget to complete the cycle. Next slide, please. So, in summary, access controls are one of the top priorities for an organization, CISO or security leader. It really is. It is the top one, should be one of the top priorities. The maturity of the organization's administrative and technical controls has a direct impact on how user access is managed, and the maturity level also directly impacts the frequency of reviews and audits required to meet both internal and external, as well as regulatory compliance requirements. And the key to making this all happen and making it happen smoothly is, of course, automation of user provisioning, deprovisioning, auditing review, etc. This helps improve your overall maturity, so you can get up to from the 2 to 3 to the 4 to 5 on the maturity level there, as well as improving the effectiveness of access controls and auditing. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you found this informative and helpful. And I will turn it back over to Austin now, and he can kind of show you his really cool product. So thank you.
I really appreciate it, Kelly. That was extremely knowledgeable, tons of information to unpack there. And I think if anything is to be taken away, it's that there's a lot required if you want to, one, protect your company, but two, also just meet the requirements of the law. I like the 2 quotes that you left us with too, especially. To boil these down, I would say it seems that mainly a security system should not be a burden to your company. And it should also be simple to use and understand that anyone can really identify the areas of risks. YouAttest was pretty much built to answer the questions of how do we meet the compliance needs set before us and protect our company in a simple, user-friendly way. So you mentioned so much as documentations, you needed proper records, delegation to take place. There was a huge list of areas that you have to meet, but it doesn't mean that the system you're going to implement has to be complex. So going into that, when we first went into the auditing world, we noticed that there were 2 systems set in place, and we weren't big fans of either of them, but This is basically what was set before us. You either had this one solution that required on-premise software, it was bulky, you needed a complete team of individuals to run it. What this looks like when you actually deploy it is something like this, where you have, like I mentioned, an entire team, an entire user group that has to maintain, that has to keep running this. And we like to use the analogy that this is kind of like owning a private jet. You have to have an expert pilot. You have to rent out the tarmac. You have to, have a flight crew, pay for the fuel, have the insurance, do all the maintenance. That's a lot. If your company, if their main focus isn't just on auditing, if it isn't just on producing a report saying that they're, compliant. So when you're managing applications, this might be too much, and it's definitely going to be extremely expensive. Well, there's another option. Kelly mentioned it a few times. He said the dreaded spreadsheet. And option 2 is a little like taking the Greyhound bus. This, of course, is going to save you money, but it will cost you a tremendous amount of time. Time with macros and formulas, links to other complex sheets, tying you up with busy works. And this really creates a lot of risk for you as well. So how do they create risk? Well, this is a lot through the documentation being transferred. How many times is that stored or copied or saved on another device? Who knows how many people actually have this spreadsheet that you're using to keep your either data safe or just manage who has access to what applications. Also, your spreadsheets won't be able to capture things in real time. So you might not know if there's a duplicate account. I know Kelly mentioned a few times that you want to make sure that if an employee leaves, is that record being captured? This might not be capturing that in real time. So what's the solution? Well, that's why we created YouAttest. YouAttest is 100% cloud-based, creating no need for costly on-premise software. You don't have to have teams of experts on hand, and you don't need countless hours of maintenance. YouAttest is like buying an airline ticket. Basically, you get where you need to go. You don't need a pilot. You don't need the hangar. You don't need the fuel, the flight crew. You are able to just simply do what you need to do, get from point A to point B without having to have all these extras on top of there. So with that being said, I really wanted to give a chance to kind of show how the framework is set up, and then give you all just a really quick demo on how it performs attestation reports, how you could make changes within an Okta tenant and really have control over your applications in that environment. This is a high-level overview of just how YouAttest is integrated with Okta, and it allows you to make real changes of either certifying or revoking access to individual applications within Okta. This is all just accomplished through a simple API integration. So as mentioned, it's all in the cloud, no on-premise software. It takes about 5 minutes to set up, if that. Let's jump on into the demo though. So here I'm going to pull it up. This is just a login screen. We'll use a placeholder here. So you'll enter in your company's name. You'll go on over here, and right now you're logging into your Okta portal because this is tethering the two accounts together. It's allowing you to pull information from Okta applications and simply have access to them within YouAttest so you can run these attestation reports. As mentioned, it's a simple API integration. This is all the deployment necessary when you're actually setting this up. You just name it, you provide your Okta URL, and you enter in your API key, and you're set. That is all that is needed in deploying this. So let's actually run a campaign. So we go here to our campaign list, and we'll create a new one. We'll select the API source. We'll name it. We just do webinar test. And we'll select the date. Let's say this is needs to be completed by the 30th. We'll go on to this. And in this screen right here, what this is showing you is all the applications that are currently in your company's environment. So in this test one that we set up, these are all the applications you could run attestation reports for, you can make changes within. So you would simply just select one right here. And once you click done, right now, it just pulled the information. And once we log in, you can see these are individuals who have access to the application. So right here, you could even see their roles and their profile. This is all managed through, so this would have to be filled in through lifecycle management within Okta or within whatever system you're using. And that would show up right there. So if you label individuals a certain title, it will mention that there. And that kind of goes back to what we were really talking about when Kelly was going over some of the key parts of auditing. So you need to have that identification on who has access to what. Well, this first step shows you right there. And once you've found this individual, you can see what applications and records they have access to by just clicking into each one. So you can see this user, once it pulls up, has access to the following applications. This helps with verifying the authentication process of it. And then next, we go back over to this, and you can see what their title is. Well, that covers the authorization. Are they authorized to have access to this? At what level does that need to be changed? And then finally, you have the accountability, and that can be seen in the following ways. So let's just go through these. We'll say we looked at them and we'll certify them. There's a few in here, maybe this user, and this user that need to be revoked. They no longer are with the company or they're no longer working on this project. So we'll revoke them right here and it'll go as such. Also, if we have the feature that if you revoke someone, say you want to record that or make a note, you could do so simply by putting it right here. So you're able to keep track of changes made and special cases that come up, which is really key when you're auditing, so you can keep track of the anomalies. Finally, if you would like, you could delegate it out, so you have a proper existing controls, but you could simply fill this in with the user, the email of the manager of this individual or this group. But now once we've done this, we'll go right back out to the campaigns list. And you can see our report's 100% complete, but we haven't made any changes to the application access just yet. We actually have to click execute. And once we do that, now this is the step where we are making that change within Okta. So those 3 users that we picked and said, you are no longer with the company or you're no longer with this project, those 3 users will no longer have access to that application. But you don't have to take my word for it. If we go to the print screen right here and I pull this up, we could actually see a full report of how these users no longer have access. We could see what time it was reviewed on. We could see which application it was, and we could also see the action taking place if it was certified, revoked, or delegated out. So this kind of answers the question where we're talking about, is there documentation? Are there records? Is there an audit trail that took place? You're able to have a physical document in front of you, and it's not like a spreadsheet where it is kind of limited to the information that you have on hand. This is a snapshot. Just takes a couple, maybe a minute to pull and put together a complete report. And now you have this in front of you, and you have something that is verifying that your users, you have control and you have the power to see what they have access to and on what level they actually have access to that application. That's really it for the demo side. It is pretty straightforward. Going into how much does YouAttest actually cost, it's also really straightforward as well. It's just $2 a user. And so that demo that I pulled up had 12 users in that application. That would just be $24 a month right there. So it's monthly based. Also, it's cancel anytime. So if you just have to, perform an audit quarterly, you could only pay for 4 months and cancel the other 8. And it's very simple to process. It's all just through Stripe. So you could sign up with a credit card, cancel anytime. We are doing a 30-day trial. So if you are interested in signing up, just mention you were on the webinar and I'll reach out and we could set you up with the 30-day trial. You could try risk-free, cancel anytime you want. That being said, I'll open it up for any questions that you have throughout the presentation. Kelly is also still online, so if there's anything specifically you would like to ask him, he's available as well. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for Kelly, your expertise, and thank you for all the attendees. I definitely appreciate you taking an hour out of your busy day to learn a little bit more about this. So thank you. Oh, so Kelly, it looks like we do have one question coming in, and this is just mentioning, it said that at one point you mentioned that spreadsheets were devastating to your auditing work. Can you elaborate on this a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. When you're taking the amount of data, which I kind of outlined in the presentation there, the amount of data that you need to collect and list out for a particular owner, and identifying the asset, all the specifics of that asset, the classification information, the labeling, et cetera, all of those items. If you take that amount of information, and it's a considerable amount, and then you apply that to all of the different assets that that individual owner may own. Let's just say the director of IT. There's a lot of assets for that individual. And they have to go through and they have to look at each asset. They have to make sure that the individuals that have access should have access, and at what level. It can be a very tedious process that takes a large amount of time. And of course, if you have someone in your organization that perhaps you can delegate to, that helps. But if you don't, and you're the owner of many, many, many different assets, the sheer amount of time that it takes can be very much overwhelming. So that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And it does kind of come back to one of the requirements, one of the jobs of preparing that report for that particular owner is to provide to that owner the minimal amount of information that is needed to answer the questions that he needs to answer it, to receive that attestation that it's been reviewed and that things are good to go, which is also what I truly love about the YouAttest product, because it builds that process right in. As far as the certification process for that individual, and it provides the information that's needed and nothing else. So anyway, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, excellent. I appreciate your feedback on that one, Kelly. So we have another question. It's inquiring, is YouAttest specifically linked with Okta? So yes, YouAttest is limited to Okta. It just works with your Okta environment. So if you're running something else to manage your applications, it won't work with that. But if you do have any sort of suggestions or you run a different system, feel free to reach out and email, and we could see what we could do and what we could work with. But currently we are with Okta because Okta is 100% cloud-based. We figured we'd go with the system that's similar to what our focus is. So, but great question. I appreciate the response there. It looks like we're kind of wrapping up here. So I notice we're keeping you over an hour. Want to keep things short. But if you do have anything that you think of, if you want to ask the question to Kelly, if you want to ask it directly towards me, feel free. You see my contact information on there. It's just austing@youattest.com. There's also my phone number. It's been a really pleasure just to have everyone on here to learn a little bit more and really just to kind of gauge what you're all thinking. So thank you so much for your time. And Kelly, I'll give you a chance to say goodbye, but thank you very much, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, Austin, and thanks to everyone who's attended. If you have any questions that perhaps I can answer, reach out to Austin and he'll get that to me. Thank you again.
Excellent. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone have a great rest of your week. Take care.